When it comes to bunions, many tend to blame hereditary factors. However, the root causes of a bunion are, by large estimates, narrow shoes and shoes with an elevated heel, like most traditional running shoes, which are narrow in the front and typically have a stacked cushion heel. In that regard, it's no surprise that the traditional running shoe has a very unimpressive record for preventing bunions or halting the enlargement of a bunion, since most traditional running shoes are constructed with a very narrow toe box, which is the type of architectural framework of a shoe that attracts bunion development and accelerates the enlargement of a current bunion. This should be very obvious to everyone that a narrow toe box of a running shoe is a standard barrier for toe splay and forefoot expansion, whereby the complete lack of forefoot expansion and toe spread at each step in narrow running shoes makes these shoes an unqualified therapeutic intervention for bunion treatment. However, it's not just a narrow toe box that negatively reconfigures the front of the foot, making your foot progressively narrow and highly vulnerable to bunion development. Another unergonomically structural component of most traditional running shoes, known to perpetuate a more narrow, weaker forefoot, is the stacked heel, or a large heel to toe differential. Most traditional running shoes have a substantially high elevated heel, or a large heel to toe offset, very similar to a high heeled women's shoe. The heel is always propped up high off the ground relative to the toes and the forefoot. It's this positional arrangement of the foot that may plant the seeds for bunion development and may feed bunion growth. According to reports in a 2011 article published in Harvard Women's Health Watch, wearing a shoe with a large heel to toe offset places a huge burden on the front of the foot in ways that may drive bunion growth. The researchers revealed that wearing a shoe with a large heel to toe offset tips the body forward, which was found to have pronounced effects on increasing plantar pressure on the big toe, which may overload the big toe, or the MTP joint. The dangers of this, the MTP joint bearing the cost of this kind of pressurized overload, is the end result of pressure-driven bunion growth, because the added weight exerted on the forefoot and the toes physically jams and forces the front of the foot farther into the front of the shoe. And if you are wearing a shoe with a very narrow toe box that's inflexible and very stiff, it won't be able to accommodate the strenuous abnormal protrusion of the forefoot when most of your body weight is intensively and heavily concentrated over the base of the big toe, or the MTP joint, like it is when you wear a narrow shoe with a very large heel to toe differential. Therefore, the feet will be repeatedly squeezed into a more narrow framework at each step. This negative interaction will consolidate into misshapen joints in the forefoot, leading to pressure-induced bunion growth. And in addition to the inception of a bunion, your forefoot will also anatomically mold into the same architectural shape as the front of the shoe, which is narrow and pointy. What would be the consequences of this during running? For one, failure to make efficient use of toe splaying during running could lead to reductions in balance control, which is an open slot for injury. Secondly, a narrow arrangement of the front of the foot may lack the spatial capacity to adequately absorb impact and could lead to cumulative impact loads on the forefoot, which could overheat the small bones that line the top of the foot and may cause a metatarsal head to crack under the high pressure that may occur from this. Ultimately, the bunion is another shining example of how the traditional running shoe may eat away at your foot health by radically reshaping your foot and may cause long-term damage to the foot. This type of change to the foot's anatomy could lead to a number of difficult problems during running, such as further defections in foot function, which could lead to excessive over or under pronation, and reductions in landing stability, which could deter you from running safely and efficiently. The take-home message from all of this is that a narrow toe box coupled with an elevated heel of a running shoe may be the underlying vulnerabilities for bunion growth by creating a supply chain of physical stressors and pressurized forces that misshape the front of the foot. And of course, when the foot is physically compromised in this way, the coercive nature that these shoes impose on the foot can lead to failures in balance control and inadequate impact deflection during running. Thus, injuries may follow you everywhere you go with this type of structural damage on the foot. Another serious point to make is that it could make your foot ankle complex more resistant to efforts to improve balance control, which again does very little in helping you avoid injury during running. However, when it comes to impeding bunion growth, the first order of business is to remove the architectural mobility restrictions on the forefoot and the toes, whereby walking and running barefoot may pay off in reducing the size of your bunion and may be a promising path forward in leading to significant improvements in bunion symptoms, and again could make it possible to optimize reductions in bunion growth, which in turn could help prevent the negative mechanical outcomes associated with a narrow bunionated forefoot. First and foremost, running and walking barefoot can really give the pursuit to a wider forefoot and possibly a smaller bunion, because there's greater architectural mobility of the toes and the forefoot, which could have enormously profound corrective effects on your bunion, since one of the greatest outcomes of increased barefoot activity is induced forefoot expansion, increased toe flexion, and increased toe splay at each step. And when you're barefoot, the forefoot and toes can flex more fully, they can expand more fully, your toes have the freedom to spread out more fully because there's nothing restricting or preventing toe splay or toe spreading, which collectively may be both necessary and sufficient enough to help prevent bunion enlargement. The big improvements in toe splay and toe flexion, as well as the overall increased concentrated engagement of the forefoot and the toes during barefoot running and barefoot walking, may translate into improvements in toe alignment, as well as improvements in muscle and tendon and ligament alignment that surrounds the bunion, which may help reduce the size of the bunion. This more than suggests that walking barefoot and running barefoot may be the most potent of all in being helpful in bringing real results in scaling back bunion growth. This is how running barefoot and walking barefoot can be a powerful way to transform your overall foot health, especially since under barefoot conditions, your toes and forefoot are essentially in the prime position where they are more robustly engaged, they're more repeatedly engaged, which are the underlying dynamics of building a stronger, wider, more capable foot. And a lot seems to get better when your feet are healthy, viable, and strong. You will also be more balanced because increased toe splay increases your access to better landing stability and balance control, in which this strength and steadiness coming from the feet may help narrow down your chances of getting a running related injury. Because of this, I've always viewed barefoot running and barefoot walking as a sufficient starting place in helping dismantle bunion growth. When you go barefoot, there's really no reason for your bunion to get worse as compared to constantly stuffing your foot into the traditional running shoe, which have tough to avoid risk factors like a narrow toe box, like an elevated heel, causing the toes to be squished together tightly. And in this restricted capacity, the toes will never be able to engage effectively in balance control. In this regard, traditional running shoes may not do really anything to offer protective substance. Running shoes can't do everything. Bunions seem to be a signature problem associated with modern footwear. This is why bunion enlargement trends are commonly seen in those who wear footwear with a very narrow toe box with an elevated heel. So I hope that knowing this further validates that barefooting is what you can do to avoid bunion enlargement. And so hopefully understanding this would be a very motivating factor to increase your barefoot activity, because high levels of toe splay, forefoot expansion, and toe flexion via barefoot running and barefoot walking are more likely to be involved in halting bunion growth, whereas long-term use of narrow high-heeled running shoes may be the single biggest contributor to bunion development. I posted a blog post version of this video along with a link to the study that I briefly touched on in this video down below in the description box. To stay updated on all the latest research regarding the health benefits of barefoot running and forefoot running, hit the subscribe button below. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Have fun out there on the roads and trails. Bye for now.